Hello and welcome to Stitch and Thread. My name is Anna, and on this channel I like to share what I'm up to in my crafting journey, which is mostly knitting at the moment. Today I have a very special episode on how to approach a knitting pattern as a beginner knitter. I'm one of them. I believe this is going to be quite a chatty episode, so please get cozy, get a nice beverage, possibly a hot one if you're in Northern Hemisphere, and let's begin. I should apologize straight away if I'm looking down. I do have quite a few notes with me today. I try to systemize everything I want to say and it's just too much. So if I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at my notes. So about a year ago, I have started knitting my first ever garment. It was a Woodsmoke sweater by McDonald. I'll put a picture if I can. It was a simple round yoke sweater. I knitted it for my child. I followed a 4-hour tutorial from the designer, which I'm very grateful, on YouTube actually. You might have a different journey, which is absolutely fine, but I found that was a very good introduction into garment knitting for someone who was very apprehensive. Before I start talking about my suggestions and tips, please take them with a pinch of salt. We're all different, we have a different journey. If you are a beginner knitter yourself, possibly some tips and suggestions will be useful to you. If you're an experienced knitter, I would love to hear what recommendations or advice you have, or if you remember what was so important that you found out during your first year of garment knitting. So my first piece of advice is to choose a pattern that you would like to knit very carefully. So what do I mean? I think a lot of us, or at least I am, sometimes going through this rabbit hole of looking at beautiful patterns on Instagram, and I just want to knit the pattern instantly, which is all sound, and I think it is lovely to knit something that you're really excited about. However, as we know what Instagram is, it shows you lovely pictures and you just see how almost models, they're wearing them, and usually in special poses. However, the reality is, and sometimes we see it on YouTube as well from some podcasters at least, that do share their honest opinion on garments. The garment might not be fitting properly. There are some issues with the garment, and what I think is very good advice for beginner knitter is to go to Ravelry. If you don't know, Ravelry is an invaluable source for knitters. It allows you to check for patterns, for yarns, for different colorways of yarns, and you can filter patterns. You can have your own knitting life there. It just kind of it is a separate topic on its own, but essentially what Ravelry allows you to do is to look for a pattern that you'd like to make. Then it will allow you to see the clarity rating of the pattern. So if a lot of people have knitted, the pattern will have a clarity which says, from 1 to 5, right? So try to find a pattern, or look for a pattern at least with higher rating. Also, check the size you are planning to make. I'm actually quite a petite lady, and when we're talking about size inclusivity, sometimes there are no patterns, or some sweaters are just not designed for someone like me in mind. I sometimes also do not want to have 40 centimeters, what is it, 20 inches of positive ease. I might just not. And some patterns do not provide patterns for smaller ladies as well, at least as small as me. So please look for that. Try to find a pattern which has been knit by many knitters, and check their size. So for example, if you size XS, look at how this garment fits on people of your or similar size. Also, it is a good idea to check which yarns people use. So often designers, they go and collaborate with some yarn companies and they have very expensive yarns, which might not be available in your region whatsoever, or might be just out of your budget. So it's good to see what yarn alternatives there are. There is a website, I think Yarn Sub, I'll put it in the description below as well, which can help you to find alternatives. But I feel Ravelry is also a good source because people are like us, they need alternative solutions. So say you have access to a specific yarn, you can filter by that yarn and see if any people have knitted using that yarn. Also, once you purchase yarn, it would be a very good idea to go through the pattern. I probably wouldn't recommend you as a novice to go through the whole pattern. You might just get scared, or at least I did a couple of times. I like to divide my knitting into like sizable chunks which I read. Possibly not the best advice. Sometimes people say you have to read the whole pattern, but I don't find it particularly useful for me. Having said that, you should go through the first page very carefully, where it discusses all the yarns, notions, knitting needles you'll need, and all that stuff. I had an unfortunate situation with my Melides dress, which I knitted this summer. I, for some reason, didn't really look carefully how many buttons I will need for this dress, and I think I purchased 12. I thought 12 buttons is plenty. However, when I realized I don't have enough, it was August, the shop was closed for the whole month, and that resulted in me not being able to wear my Melides dress this summer. So I have to wait for the next one to wear it. Do not follow my mistakes. So once you chose a pattern, ideally, this is the time when you would like to choose your yarn. What I would do, I would try to find the yarn you really, really love, that you're excited about, that you touch and you just can't get enough of it. It could be the color of the yarn, it could be the softness of the yarn, it could be something else entirely, but something that would keep you going through knitting the garment, because as a beginner knitter we need reasonably slow, and we need something to keep the excitement going. I would recommend, if you have visit your local yarn store, because the shop assistants there are usually very knowledgeable. Another thing which is important in terms of yarn is be smart about your yarn choice. I would say that wool is probably the best choice for beginners because it is really forgiving. You block the garment and all the inconsistencies, or at least most of them, will become invincible. And plant-based fibers like silk, like cotton, like linen, they all show everything. Any inconsistencies, anything will be shown, including even like weaving the ends. Everything will be seen. So whilst you might think that knitting a tee or a camisole will be fast and easier, it might not be the case. And my example is actually I had knitted a Soho top this summer, a lovely top. I used Drops Muscat yarn, which is 100% cotton, but not only it was quite difficult, and like as I said, like everything can be seen, any inconsistency, but also it was quite hard on my hands, and which most plant-based fibers are. And it was a small cami, like a small top, but I'm like at the point where I wouldn't want to knit with 100% cotton ever in my life. And so yes, I would really recommend to have at least some wool in your first garments that you make. I also made a Calm Night Cami, another garment, another camisole, and that yarn was it was BC Garn Bio Balance, and it was 90% cotton and 10% cashmere. And you think, 10% cashmere, it's not a lot, but it made huge difference to the feel of the yarn, and it's still mostly a plant-based fiber, but was much easier. So if you feel like you would like to knit a summer garment, maybe it's summer now for you, or if you're in Southern Hemisphere, you're approaching summer, I would probably suggest to use a blend, say 50% merino, 50% cotton. It would still feel quite different and more like wool rather than cotton. It would be much easier on your hands, and chances are you are more likely to be happy with your garment. Another piece of advice in terms of yarn, and I'm really guilty of this, try not to buy yarn for a dozen projects ahead of time. The thing is, we do not knit as fast as we might want. I mean, at least I don't. At the beginning of the year, I kind of had this urge to buy and try all these different yarns. I'm still very fortunate that I was able to afford the yarn, but now 6 months later down the line, I feel that the weight of this yarn, that I'm still looking at it rather than it's already a knitted garment, just weighing me down. So do not follow in my shoes. I think ideally you would like to purchase yarn for a couple of garments ahead of time. If you feel like knitting is your thing, you'd like to stick with it. But yeah, I feel like if you have too much yarn, how gorgeous it is doesn't matter. You just lose that excitement. I think it's just nice when yarn comes, you're really excited, you want to cast on straight away or within reasonable amount of time. So yes, that's my recommendation. But of course, you do what you feel like. Once you have your yarn in place, make sure you swatch. So when you swatch, apart from needing to know your gauge, I think it's very important to see the resulting fabric, and generally to practice your lace motif or your cable or even color work. Actually, I had a situation when I purchased some yarn and I started doing the color work because there were two colors, and I just hated it. I mean, I just felt it doesn't work. It wasn't just the question of colors do not match. I just didn't like it. So I had to abandon the idea completely and purchase a completely different yarn. Yes, I think your swatch is not just to count your stitches and the amount of rows. It's also to see how your garment will turn up. My swatches still lie sometimes to me. I had a couple of situations of that sort. So I always try on my garments as I need to make sure I do not need the whole thing just to find out everything is completely wrong. And because of that, I think going back into patterns, I would also not recommend you to start with bottom-up constructions because they often do not allow you to try on your garment, and it's exactly what's going to happen. Maybe your garment would be too small, or you would get all the way from the bottom to your neck to find out it just doesn't suit you. So at least at the beginning, I think it's quite good to stay to knit a garment from the top down so you can try it on as you go. So the next piece of advice is to use the right tools for knitting. That's the huge one actually in itself. So first of all, you need to know what you actually want to knit. If it's socks, you need one set of needles. But if we're talking about garments, and mostly I'm talking about garments here, and your own knitted wardrobe, I think it would be a solid advice to have a set of interchangeable needles. I mean, I do understand it is quite difficult to straight away spend a lot of money on a set of needles. They are actually, some of them at least, are really expensive. So I'm in the UK, and we have a shop called Wool Warehouse, and it sells a lot of drops yarns and also has drops needles. Let me just show you. So just to show you, so I purchased this drops set, interchangeable needle set. It starts with 3.5mm needles up to 8mm. Sorry, not sure what it is in US. It doesn't say here either. The good thing about interchangeable needles is not only the amount of needles you use, for example, I never really used size 8 or 7, don't really do bulky weights, but you still have them. The good thing is that when you need a sweater, you often need to change the cables, say from 40 centimeters to 60 to 80 centimeters, and without, you know, changing a lot, you just change the cable and that's it. And it's very useful. I even purchased additionally a couple of cables. So drops cables, they're interchangeable with Knit Pro cables, I believe. Unfortunately, Knit Pro cables do not seem to have it written how many centimeters each cable is, but each cable is a different color, so if you remember, you would know. But very useful. I mean, cables are generally quite useful. Having said all that, it's a better idea to try the needle before you purchase the whole set. So even with a drop set, before I purchased it, I purchased a couple of regular fixed circular needles. Sorry about the noise. For example, just simple ones like these. So once I felt that I'm reasonably comfortable with the needles, you know, I purchased the whole set. Why I don't think it's a good idea to invest in a set straight away. I actually purchased quite a few needles to try on different brands to see what I like, and you know, some purchases were more successful than others. For example, there's a great brand I can highly recommend, are the novel needles. They're like square sort of needles. They're supposed to be very ergonomic. The cable is actually quite nice here, but the feel of the needles, I didn't like them. So they feel like quite hollow, and for some projects I think I tried, my yarn would just be stuck to it and just didn't really like it. So yeah, I mean, I was thinking about these needles, but I realized I would never purchase a set because I just do not enjoy. The same one about this actually, Knit Pro Nova Cubics. I actually had a couple, I believe. It was interesting. I quite like the knitting needle here. However, the cable is so stiff. It's just ridiculous. And if not for the cable, I actually would be really happy with these needles. Also, I know that a lot of the time people recommend to have wooden needles for beginners. And actually, I do have a set. I just took it. So I have this C-knit Koshitsu knitting needles. The only reason I have them is because it's a smaller size than my drops. They're from 2.5 millimeter to 3.25, which is just under what I have in my drop set. It's a US size 1.5 to 3, it says here. These are obviously small circumference, small needles, and I'm actually still quite happy that I purchased this because they have a really cool swivel cable. It's such a revelation, swivel cables, because again, I was talking about cables earlier. My knitting has never got tangled in that. I actually use this to knit my Melides dress, and one more advantage of interchangeable in comparison to normal circular needles, fixed ones, is that my purl stitches are slightly larger than my knit stitches, and the Melides dress you can have knit one row, purl the other. So what I did, I had 3 millimeter needle to knit and 2.75 millimeter needle to purl to avoid any like rowing out, and it worked perfectly. So you wouldn't be able to do it with fixed needles. Whether you need them straight away, probably not. But you should try. I think it's a good idea to try a couple of things, and once you're happy, don't try to invest in something super expensive, I think, straight away. But once you feel like knitting is a thing, maybe a year or two later, you will know what you like, and you can then invest in something that you actually love. So apart from the knitting needles, what are other useful tools? So I'm holding now this lovely stitch marker. Surprise, surprise. I quite like this light bulb stitch marker. Obviously there are, regular round ones. These are very useful if you would like to count, say, 10 rows, or if you need if you have like a lace motif and you have like a repeat, with lace motif it's very easy to make a mistake. So if you have a repeat, you can just put a stitch marker in between each repeat, and then you would always know whether you are on track, so you don't have to unravel, say, the whole long row if you do. So these are very, very useful. Another tool for knitting is either something like a tablet, or in my case, I'm like a dinosaur, I like to print my patterns. And the reason is I like to take a lot of notes, and you should do too, because you'd think you would remember whatever you did, but you don't. I have recently unraveled, actually I knitted half of the hat this spring, and I don't know if my daughter grew her head a lot, but it's just too tight for her, so I unraveled the whole thing. But I took notes on the pattern, and I didn't need to start from scratch just because I did that. I wrote which size I chose, why, what's the gauge, and so on. So I think taking notes is an immense help for you. Okay, and probably the last knitting tool which made a huge difference in my life, and I didn't expect that, which is why I really, really want to recommend to anyone, is something as simple as a barber cord. I have this lovely, the Knitting Barber, apparently the original, and I must admit it's different. I have another one, but I cannot find it. It's from Petite Knit, and the Petite Knit is quite stiff. It's very different quality from this. Let me open it. This barber cord allows you to put your stitches when you try on your sweaters or garments. So you take knitting needle, put it onto here, slide the stitches onto the barber cord. You do have in a pack, I believe, 2 for sleeves and 1 for the garment, for the body. So put the needles on the barber cord, try it on, and then again slide the needle, slide the stitches from the barber cord back onto your knitting needles. Beautiful, very simple. Before that, I was either putting my stitches onto some leftover yarn, or sometimes if I needed to the body, I would have another set of knitting needles, like additionally, so I can try, and these needles were everywhere, and it just takes forever to actually put the stitches back onto the needle, to other knitting needles. So it was a bit of a hassle, and this just saves you a hell of a time and a hell of a headache. So highly, highly recommend to try your knitting garments. So another piece of advice is learn how to fix mistakes as well as how to prevent them. So I think it's quite important in the beginning of your journey to learn the anatomy of a knit stitch and a purl stitch, and that would allow you, if for example your stitch if you dropped a stitch, to pick it up using a hook, or like a crochet hook like I have here, for example. I have a couple, I do not crochet, but these are quite useful. Sometimes I actually use them to pick up new stitches if I find that my needles are not catchy enough, but eventually you might be able to kind of pick up a random stitch even using your knitting needle. So it's not like you need them, which is why I didn't have them in my knitting arsenal, in knitting tools that you need, but it's, if you can have one, feel free, it won't hurt. Once you know the stitches, there are plenty of tutorials on YouTube how to pick them up, so feel free to search for them. I personally had a nightmare once and I didn't know what to do. I dropped actually a German row stitch, like a double stitch, and I was terrified because with the German short rows you go back and forth. I was like, how would I unravel? I would just unravel the whole thing. So I decided to look on YouTube, and someone made a video. Thank you so much. And yes, I was able to fix my mistake without unraveling, and I think this ability will make you more confident in your knitting. And I don't know about you, I actually hate frogging, and I feel if there is a way to prevent that and to have some tools to help you with that, it would be great. Back in the beginning of my knitting journey, I personally learned to knit at school. but then I stopped completely. And at the beginning of COVID in 2020, I guess it was all very stressful. I needed a way to distress, and I thought, oh, I would start knitting again. And I purchased a kit. I believe it was a cowl. If I'll find it, I'll just show you. It was quite nice. It was just like a tube, but I didn't remember how to cast on, how to knit, how to purl. I mean, the basics. So you'd think the nice thing in the kit was that there were video tutorials for how to knit, how to purl, so all the basics. However, I was shocked to find out that I did not understand. I just don't remember it to be like this at all. I was terrified and actually really confused. But it turned out that what I learned at school was continental knitting, and the tutorials supplied for English style knitting. I was very lucky. I have a good friend, and even though she was in a different country, I called her and she sorted me out, and I realized what the problem is, and I luckily I remembered how to knit and purl. But what I'm trying to say is that when you look for tutorials, how to fix mistakes or how to do some things, try ideally to find knitters who are knitting just like you. It would make things easier. There are quite a few tutorials, but obviously some for English style knitters, maybe for some other knitters, some for continental knitters. But don't be like me, don't be so confused that, I almost gave up just before I started because of that. So, and the last and valuable piece of advice is be adventurous in your knitting. Maybe you'd like to do color work, maybe you'd like to do lace or cable. What's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen is that you would frog the item, but you would learn a new skill. But if the project excites you, if you just can't stop thinking about it, just try. It might take you a while. It might be difficult, but just give it a try. A good example here is when I knitted my first sweater. There was a call starting here in the UK in support of Ventzel, and people were knitting her new design, Super Selene, and I've knitted just one garment, and I was like, it's probably too early to do color work. I was quite intimidated, but because it was a call, it was lots of people, I thought, if it comes to worst, I can always ask somebody. There would be lots of people knitting, hopefully somebody would be kind enough. So, and that's the result. It was my second project in my Super Selene, which I love, and now it's just in October. Today is actually reasonably warm, but I already was wearing it a couple of times. It's probably my most worn sweater up to date. It had a lot of complicated techniques like Italian cast on, Italian bind off. I think I did short rows, but it was all this. It was like a lot of ribbing as well, and you'd think that for the second ever sweater it's probably too early, but I really wanted it and I did it. So I think it's good to be adventurous, but in a smart way. So do not take your complicated needs to, social events. Find the right time and space where you can concentrate to prevent mistakes, actually, and to knit garments that you love. And another piece of advice is to find a knitting group nearby. It's usually full of knitters and experienced knitters. And just like shop assistants in yarn shops, they could be very, very useful. I had a very funny situation, I think in spring this year, when I went to the knitting group and I was really struggling. I was knitting a mitten with cables. I think it was my first project with cables. I was trying out. It's just one was a tiny project, which was fine, but I felt like I was following the chart correctly, everything, but it just didn't. I just couldn't see the cables. They were all wrong, and I was recommended a lady who's apparently the queen of cables, and she looked at my mitten. She wasn't sure because she looked. I do the cabling right, blah blah blah, and then next thing she did, she put my mitten inside out and all my cables were on the inside of the mitten. Why is that? It was so weird. It turned out I didn't know how to follow the chart. I mean, we read from left to right, so I expected the way you need to follow the chart was the left to right. I just couldn't imagine it was right to left, honestly. I mean, later I would have seen patterns where you would have like small arrow which points, or you would have like 1, 2, 3, you would on the right side, so it kind of suggests you might be reading from right to left, but I had no idea. And that's how I found out. So mistakes do happen. And speaking of mistakes, even this sweater, Super Selene, somehow, I mean, it also had a chart for color work, even though it's kind of symmetrical. So I was also, I think, following the chart from left to right, but it didn't make any difference, surprisingly. That's c'est la vie. And one more thing to mention is probably, again, what I think at least for beginner knitter, you probably wouldn't want to have too many projects going at once, simply because we do knit slowly, and when you have like 5, 6, 7, 8 projects and you feel like you do not make any progress on them because they seem to be multiplying but you're not finishing anything, it could be very demotivating, or at least that's how I feel. At least with knitting you want to be able to see the results of your work in knitted garments and items. So to make things easier for you, it's probably best to have 1, 2, maybe 3 projects on the go at a maximum. And then once you feel more confident, and if you feel like you want to have whatever dozen projects at once, that's up to you. It's just very important, I think, to acknowledge your wins and what you've achieved. And this is actually the video, in a way, it's my acknowledgement of the knitting journey I've been for the last year. I have a lot to learn, and I still have to remind myself that it is a journey, not a destination, that I would like to enjoy knitting, and I do, but also to limit the factors which diminish my enjoyment. So knitting is not about perfection. Let's adopt the Japan. I think it is a Japanese way of imperfection. They call it wabi-sabi. So let's do wabi-sabi because we're not perfect and we're not meant to be perfect. I sometimes really struggle with perfectionism, and even just take this YouTube channel. I'm sure I'm not speaking perfectly. English is not my native tongue, and if I would be waiting for the time when I'm able to speak perfectly, it probably would never exist. So the same with knitting. Let's just enjoy where we are in our journey, and it's our hobby. It's here to bring us joy and happiness. I'm sure there was plenty of rambling in this video, but if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. If you have any tips for beginners, I would love to hear them. I hope to film my next podcast in about a week or 2, so stay tuned and see you soon.